you have never been clean. Right now, sitting exactly where you are, roughly 38 trillion bacterial cells are living on your skin, in your gut, between your teeth, inside the folds of your ears. That number comes from Ron Sender, Shai Fuchs, and Ron Milo at the Weizmann Institute, who in 2016 sat down and actually recalculated a figure biology textbooks had been repeating for decades. The old claim was that microbes outnumber your own cells 10 to 1. They found the real ratio is closer to 1 to 1. 38 trillion of them. 30 trillion of you. Which sounds like a downgrade until you sit with what it means. You are not a person carrying some bacteria. You are roughly half a person by cell count, walking around inside a weather system of other organisms. And here is the part that should unsettle you slightly. That number does not drop when you shower. You can scrub with hot water and antibacterial soap and a cloth until your skin goes pink. And within hours, the same populations are back at the same densities, recolonizing from your pores, your follicles, the layer underneath the layer you just washed. Your skin microbiome is not sitting on top of you like dust. It is grown into you. The bathroom ritual you perform every morning, the one that makes you feel like you have crossed from dirty to clean, is not removing anything. It is moving oils around and knocking back a surface population that is already rebuilding before the towel is dry. So hold that thought, because it changes the whole question. When you picture people in the deep past, you probably picture filth, matted hair, black teeth, a smell you could lean into. That image is doing a lot of work in your head. And it comes almost entirely from a specific kind of storytelling rather than from evidence. The real record, the one written into teeth and bone and cave floors and Roman drains, says something far stranger. It says that grooming is older than our species, that people were treating infected mouths before anyone farmed anything, that the single most sophisticated sanitation system of the ancient world made absolutely no difference to the parasites inside the people using it. Two things I want you holding on to as this goes. The first is a jaw, specific one, from a pit in northern Spain, with marks on the teeth that took researchers years to interpret correctly, and which push deliberate personal grooming back 430,000 years, long before anyone who looked like you existed. The second is Rome, because Rome is the moment this entire story is supposed to turn. Aqueducts, public baths on every corner, sewers big enough to sail a boat through. Every version of this story you have ever heard treats Roman sanitation as the point where humanity finally starts winning. The bones from Roman cemeteries say the opposite, and they say it so clearly that a Cambridge researcher had to publish a paper explaining why the obvious conclusion was the correct one. Before you decide your ancestors were filthy, look at what somebody was doing to their own teeth 430,000 years ago. There is a place in the Sierra de Atapuerca in northern Spain called the Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. You reach it by crawling half a kilometer through a cave system and then descending a 13-meter shaft, at the bottom of which sit the remains of at least 28 individuals, packed into clay. Nobody is certain how they got there. What is certain is the date. Uranium series and luminescence dating, published by Arnold and colleagues, puts the deposit at around 430,000 years old. These are not modern humans. They are early Neanderthal ancestors, a population that split from your line hundreds of thousands of years before you existed as a species. The Mari Nalo Tano and her colleagues at Atapuerca did something obvious that almost nobody bothers with. They looked at the sides of the teeth. Chewing wears down the tops. That is expected, and every set of ancient teeth shows it. On these jaws, there are grooves worn into the gaps between the molars, running horizontally, in the narrow space where two teeth meet near the gum line. Food does not do that. Chewing does not do that. Nothing in a normal diet produces a smooth channel scored into the side of a tooth, right at the point where the gum sits. The only thing that produces that pattern is an object being pushed into that gap, over and over, for years. A stick, a splinter of bone, something rigid, worked back and forth between the teeth, habitually, by the same individual, across a long enough span of life to leave a permanent groove in enamel. Now sit with the detail that makes it human. Grooves cluster around teeth that show signs of periodontal disease, which is inflamed and receding gum tissue. the kind that leaves the bone of the jaw visibly eaten away. So these are not bored people picking at their food. These are people with sore, swollen, infected gums, and something jammed painfully between the teeth, doing the one thing you would do: digging at it, finding a stick and working at the spot that hurt, again and again, for long enough to grind a groove into their own mouths. 430,000 years ago, before language as you would recognize it, before art, before your species existed anywhere on Earth, there is no version of that behavior that is accidental. A toothpick is a tool used on your own body, for comfort, aimed at a problem you can feel but cannot see. Requires you to notice discomfort, locate its source, select an object, and repeat the procedure for years. That is grooming. That is hygiene, in the most literal sense, older than our species, by a factor that is genuinely hard to hold in your head. And here is the part nobody saw coming. They were picking something out. The stuff they left behind on those teeth turned out to be the single richest record of ancient life we have ever found. Twice a year, someone scrapes your teeth with a metal hook, and you rinse and spit, and never think about it again. That yellowish crust they are removing has a name: dental calculus. Plaque that stopped being soft, mineralized by the calcium in your own saliva, turning a living bacterial film into stone. It is the only part of your body that fossilizes while you are still alive. And it does not just harden, it captures. Everything passing through your mouth gets caught in that hardening film and sealed there permanently. Bacterial DNA, starch granules from plants, fibers, pollen, smoke particles, pigment. The whole biography of what you ate and breathed and put in your mouth, laminated in place, layer over layer, year after year, and then preserved in the ground for tens of thousands of years after everything soft about you is gone. Christina Warren-Nur is the researcher who made the field take this seriously. In 2014, working on skeletons from a medieval monastery at Dahlheim in Germany, her team pulled an entire ancient oral microbiome out of calculus, along with dietary traces and DNA from disease-causing bacteria. Not a fragment, functioning reconstruction of what was living in a person's mouth roughly 1,000 years ago. Then in 2019, she and Ani Taradini published something in Science Advances that turned a piece of calculus into a biography. The individual was a woman, buried at that same monastery, sometime between 1000 and 1200. No name on the grave, no account of her life anywhere. What her teeth had was a scatter of brilliant blue particles embedded in the calculus, and when the team ran the mineralogy, the blue turned out to be lapis lazuli, ultramarine. In that period, the stone was mined in one place on Earth, in what is now Afghanistan, and ground into a pigment that cost more than gold, reserved for the most valuable illuminated manuscripts in Europe. It was inside her teeth because she had been licking the tip of a fine brush to keep the point sharp, over and over, for years, which means she painted them. The assumption for a very long time was that manuscript illumination in that era was work done by monks. Here is a woman with the most expensive pigment in medieval Europe, worn into her own dental plaque. And the only reason anyone knows she existed as an artist at all is that nobody in her life ever cleaned her teeth properly. Not brushing built the archive. Inside one Neanderthal's plaque was something that had no business being in a Neanderthal's mouth. El Sidron is a cave in As, 2 Rias, in northern Spain, holding the remains of 13 Neanderthals who died roughly 48,000 years ago. 2017, Laura Weyrich and her colleagues published an analysis of their dental calculus in Nature. And one individual came back with a story you could almost narrate, hour by hour. Start with what was wrong with him. He was young, an adolescent male, and his jaw carries a dental abscess, an infection at the root of a tooth that had eaten a visible hole into the bone. If you have ever had one, you know the specific quality of that pain. It does not come and go. Sits there and throbs and radiates up into the eye socket and makes sleep a negotiation. That was not his only problem. His calculus also contained DNA from enterocytozoa on B and UC, an intestinal parasite that causes severe, sustained diarrhea. So this was a teenager with a rotting tooth in his face and his gut in open revolt, in a cave in Ice Age Spain, with no medicine that anyone had ever thought to write down. Except his teeth say he was treating it. Sealed in the same calculus were traces of Poplar, not poplar as food. And this was not a hunter with poplar in his diet, because the rest of the Sidron group showed nothing like it. Poplar bark contains salicylic acid. That is the compound aspirin was built from. Chew poplar, and you are taking a crude dose of the same painkiller you would swallow today for the exact same tooth. And alongside it, traces of Penicillium mold, the genus that gave the world its first antibiotic. Now, careful here, because this is where it would be easy to overclaim, and the researchers themselves were careful. Penicillium, I'm turning up on plant material, is not proof he understood infection or knew what an antibiotic was. What the poplar shows, with far more force, is targeted self-medication. A bitter, non-nutritious bark, absent from everyone else in the group, concentrated in the mouth of the one individual with a raging tooth infection. He was in pain, and he was chewing something that helped, and he kept doing it long enough to leave it in the stone on his teeth. 48,000 years ago, a teenager with a face full of infection worked out what to put in his mouth to make it hurt less. Nobody in his world could write it down. It survived anyway, because he did not brush his teeth. So they treated the inside of the mouth. What was living in their hair was a war they never won. Clothing gave lice a permanent address, and the address is written in their DNA. There are two kinds of lice that live on human beings, and the difference between them is the strangest historical document your body has ever carried. Head lice grip hair. That is all they can do. Their claws are shaped to clamp a shaft of hair. They feed on the scalp, and they glue their eggs to strands close to the skin where the warmth is. Body lice are almost identical creatures. Same genus, same size, same appetite. But their claws are wider, and they do not live on you at all. They live in the seams of your clothing. They crawl out to feed, then retreat into the fabric to lay eggs against the stitching. Which means a body louse cannot exist on a naked animal. Sit with that for a second, because it is the whole trick. Body lice are obligate parasites of clothed humans. No clothes, no habitat, no lice. So the moment that population split off from the head lice and started specializing in fabric, something had to have existed for them to specialize in. Their birthday is the birthday of clothing. And you can date a birthday like that. Every population of living things accumulates mutations in its DNA at a rough and measurable pace. So if you take two related populations and count how far their genes have drifted apart, you can run the clock backwards to the moment they separated. Geneticists call it a molecular clock. It is blunt, gives you a window, not a date. But it works on lice, as well as it works on anything. Ralph Kittler, Manfred Kaiser, and Mark Stoneking ran that calculation in 2003, published in Current Biology, and got an answer that startled people because it was so recent. Body lice, they estimated, had separated from head lice somewhere around 70,000 years ago. Modern humans had already been anatomically modern for a couple of 100,000 years by then. That would mean your species spent most of its existence naked in an ice age. Then Melissa Toops and David Reed went back at it in 2011 in Molecular Biology and Evolution, with more genetic markers and a wider sample of lice from across Africa. Their window came out older and broader, somewhere between roughly 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Clothing, on that reading, is older than the first modern humans who left Africa. Old enough that your ancestors were already wrapping themselves in something before they walked into Europe and met the cold. Here is what makes that number worth caring about. Clothing does not fossilize. Skins rot. Plant fiber rots. The oldest-eyed sewing needles, the bone slivers with a hole drilled through one end, show up around 40,000 years ago, and for a long time, that was the earliest hard evidence anyone had, which is like dating the invention of shoes to the invention of shoelaces. The lice say people were dressed for at least 40,000 years, possibly 130,000, before anybody figured out how to sew a seam properly. Hide scraped and tied, wrapped and pinned, good enough to keep a body warm through a European winter, and good enough for a parasite to move in permanently. That is the deal your ancestors made. They got insulation. The insulation came with tenants, and the tenants were not a nuisance. Body lice carry typhus, trench fever, and relapsing fever, and across recorded history, they have killed people in numbers that make wars look modest. Napoleon lost more of his army in Russia to louse-borne typhus than to the Russians. So the same invention that let humans hold territory north of the tree line also opened a permanent vein of infection running through every population that wore clothes. Which is why, for the next 100,000 years, an enormous share of human effort went into a single unglamorous project: getting them off. You can see how hard that fight was by looking at what people bothered to write down first. Think about the first full sentence ever written in an alphabet. Not pictograms, not accountancy marks, but a proper sentence in the direct ancestor of the letters on your keyboard. The early Canaanite script that becomes Phoenician, becomes Greek, becomes Latin, becomes this. You would expect the first thing anyone chose to spell out to be enormous: a god's name, a king's victory, a law. It is a complaint about lice. In 2016, excavators at Tel Lachish in southern Israel pulled a small ivory comb out of the dirt. 6 centimeters long, made from elephant tusk, with 2 rows of teeth cut into it. Horse teeth on one side for untangling hair, and on the other side fine teeth set close together, which is a knit comb, and which is exactly the same tool sold in pharmacies today for exactly the same purpose. Nobody noticed the writing on it for 5 years. 2021, a researcher spotted faint scratches on the surface, and Daniel Vine Stube, Yosef Gar Finkel, and Madeleine Mumju-Olu published the decipherment in 2022 in the Jerusalem Journal of Archaeology. 17 tiny letters in shallow shaky strokes dating to around 1700 BCE. They read, as best the pig roofers can render it: "May this tusk root out the lice of the hair and the beard." That is the sentence. That is what a human being, holding a piece of carved elephant ivory and one of the rarest skills on earth, decided was worth the effort of inscribing. Not a prayer for rain, a prayer for a working comb, and the object itself corroborated the wish. When Mumju-Olu, who is a specialist in exactly this, examined the comb under magnification, she found the mineralized remains of a head louse nymph still wedged between the teeth. Baby louse, 0.5 millimeter across, stuck in a comb for 3,500 years, sitting there while the alphabet it was trapped inside of grew up to write everything else. The comb tells you something the sentence alone would not. Lachish was a wealthy city. Ivory was imported and expensive. This was a luxury item, owned by someone at the top of that society, and it was covered in the same parasites as everyone else. The lice did not care about class. Neither did the response, which was to sit there and drag fine teeth through your beard, hoping. Some cultures decided that was a losing strategy and went further. Taforalt, traveling in Egypt in the 5th century BC, wrote down what the priests did, and the detail he chose to record is the one that tells you what the problem really was. They shaved their entire bodies. Every other day, according to him, they scraped the hair off their whole body so that no louse or any other unclean thing could be on them while they served the gods. He also noted they washed in cold water twice a day and twice a night and wore only fresh linen. Taforalt is a man who also reported gold-digging ants the size of foxes, so he gets checked, not believed. But this one holds up. Egyptian tomb art shows shaved heads under wigs. Razors of copper and bronze turn up in burials by the hundreds. Dish pill a Tori technique was serious, elaborate, endlessly repeated. And the logic behind it is completely coherent once you understand the enemy. You cannot win the fight in the hair. So you remove the hair. It worked. It is still the most effective delousing method ever devised. Every army that ever shaved its recruits was applying the same discovery. But look at what it does not touch. Shaved priest in fresh linen, bathing 4 times a day, still had a mouth. And the mouth was going somewhere no razor could follow. You have probably absorbed the standard story about that. Farming ruined human teeth. Hunter-gatherers had strong, clean bites. Then agriculture arrived with its porridge and its bread and its soft, starchy mush, and cavities exploded. It is a tidy story. It is in a lot of textbooks, and there is genuine truth underneath it. Most of the time, agriculture really did wreck mouths. Then there is Taforalt. Grotte des Pigeons, the cave of pigeons, sits in the Ben Isna Sen mountains of northeastern Morocco. The people buried there belonged to a culture archaeologists call the Ibero Maru Si-Un, and they were hunter-gatherers. No fields, no herds, no pottery yet. Around 15,000 years ago, which is thousands of years, before anybody in that region put a seed in the ground on purpose. Louise Humphrey and colleagues published their analysis in 2014 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the number in it does not behave. 51% of the teeth they examined had cavities, just over half. Out of 52 adults in the sample, 51 had caries, all but one person. And these were not small lesions. Teeth were destroyed to the root. Abscesses had eaten through jawbone, and the pattern of wear and loss suggests people living in more or less permanent dental pain. That is worse than most farming populations. It is a level of decay you find in societies with industrial sugar. The explanation was in the same cave, burnt and preserved. Enormous quantities of charred plant remains, and the dominant one was acorns from the sweet acorn oak, along with pine nuts, pistachios, and wild pulses. Sweet acorns are exactly what the name says. High in fermentable carbohydrate, sticky when processed. And the Taforalt people were harvesting and storing them at scale, which means eating them year-round rather than in a short seasonal window. They were also cooking them, which softens starch and makes it stick to enamel, and the bacteria in a human mouth need nothing more than that. So the cavity crisis did not wait for agriculture. It arrived the moment humans learned to store a sweet carbohydrate and eat it every day. Farming was not the cause. The farming was just the technology that made a stored carbohydrate diet universal. Their mouths were falling apart, and they knew it. You can see it in the same skeletons, in the way teeth were extracted, in the abscess drainage. What they did not have was any way to keep the rot from starting, and no way at all to be sure the water they drank was not the thing making them sick in the first place. The first people to solve the second problem built something you would recognize instantly. Go to Mohenjo-Daro today, in the Sindh province of Pakistan, and climb the mound at the center of the ruins. On top of it, surrounded by a colonnade, is a rectangular tank, 12 meters by 7, 2.5 meters deep, with brick steps leading down into it at both ends. The archaeologists call it the Great Bath. It was built around 2500 BCE. The engineering is the part that should stop you. The floor and walls are laid in tightly fitted sawn brick, and between the brick courses there is a layer of bitumen, natural tar, spread as a waterproof seal. Somebody in the 3rd millennium, BCE, looked at a brick tank and understood that brick alone would leak, and solved it with a damp-proof membrane. There is a drain at one corner, leading to a core-belled outlet big enough for a person to walk into. So the tank could be emptied and refilled with clean water, rather than left to stagnate. Now widen out from the bath to the city underneath it. The Mohenjo-Daro had covered drains running down the middle of its streets, built of brick with removable slabs on top so they could be cleaned. Individual houses had bathing floors, sloped and sealed, with chutes in the wall that fed household waste into the street drain. Many had their own wells. This is a city of perhaps 40,000 people with municipal sanitation, at a moment when most of the world had nothing of the kind, and we cannot read a word they wrote. The in-dust script survives on thousands of seals, and it has resisted every attempt at decipherment. They engineered plumbing before we can prove they engineered literature. They were not even the first. On the Orkney Islands, off the north coast of Scotland, the stone village of Skara Brae was built around 3100 BCE, 4 centuries earlier, and stone drains run beneath the houses. Small cells built into the thickness of the walls sit directly above those drains, and the standard reading is that they are indoor toilets, plumbed to carry waste away from where people slept. Neolithic farmers on a treeless island in the North Atlantic, and they put the toilet inside and piped it out. They had the bath 4,500 years ago. What they did not have, and what almost nobody had, was soap. Soap existed in Rome. Nobody washed with it. That sentence is not a trick. Sapo, the Latin word your word soap descends from, appears in Pliny the Elder's Natural History, Book 28, and Pliny is explicit about what it was for. He calls it an invention of the Gauls. He says it is made from tallow and ash, that the best comes from beech ash and goat fat, that it comes in a hard form and a soft form, and that it is used to redden the hair. Then he adds a detail that has amused historians ever since. Among the Germans, he says, the men use it more than the women. Read that again. The first soap in the written record is a men's hair dye. Nowhere does Pliny suggest a Roman took a lump of it into the baths and scrubbed. That is not what it was. Fat boiled with wood ash makes a caustic, unstable, foul-smelling paste, and the Gauls and Germans were working it into their hair to lift it toward red or blonde, the way a man today reaches for a bottle in a supermarket aisle and pretends he did not. Soap enters European history as a cosmetic. It takes centuries to become a cleaning agent, and by the time it does, Rome is gone. So what did a Roman actually do about a dirty body? Oil. You walked into the bathhouse, you stripped, and you rubbed yourself with olive oil, sometimes scented, sometimes plain. You sweated in the hot rooms until the oil had softened and lifted everything sitting on your skin. And then you or a slave took a stryil, a curved bronze blade, shaped roughly like a shallow scythe about the length of your forearm, and dragged it across your body in long strokes. What came off the blade was a gray paste of oil, sweat, dead skin, dust, and whatever the day had put on you. It had a name, strigmentum. And here is where a modern stomach turns over, because that scraping was not thrown away. Gymnasium sweat, scraped off athletes and wrestlers, was collected and sold as a medicinal preparation. Pliny records it being used on inflammations, on stiffened joints, applied as a salve. The dirt from a champion's skin had value. Somebody bought it. Think about what this means about the whole Roman relationship with the body. Nothing was waste. Not the sweat, not the scrapings, and shortly, not the urine. Because the stree handled you, could do nothing at all for a heavy wool toga stained with wine and grease and street mud. And Rome had a very different solution for that. It kept it in jars, on the street corner. And it asked you to contribute. Stale urine breaks down into ammonia. Ammonia is alkaline. It cuts grease, it lifts stains, and it strips the natural oils out of wool, so that a garment comes back to something like white. Every civilization that worked wool figured this out, and Rome industrialized it. The workshop was called a fulanaca, and the best preserved one in the world sits in Pompeii under volcanic ash, the fulanaca of Stephanus, excavated on the Via della Bon Danza. Mi Koflor, who has spent his career reconstructing how these places actually functioned, has mapped the workflow room by room. You can still see it. A row of waist-high tubs where the treading happened. Rinsing basins stepped down, so water flowed from one to the next. A courtyard where the cloth was stretched. The work itself was done with the feet. A worker stood in the tub, in the diluted urine and water and fuller's earth, and trod the cloth for hours, shifting his weight side to side, holding on to low walls built specifically to steady him. The Romans had a phrase for the movement, the fuller's dance. That is a joke made by people who did not have to do it. Where did the urine come from? Pots, set outside the workshops and on street corners, and a passing man was expected to use them. Your bladder was a raw material. Martial mentions the fuller's pots in his epigrams as an ordinary fixture of the street. The supply chain for Rome's laundry ran directly through the population's kidneys, and it was lucrative enough to tax. Suetonius, writing the life of Vespasian, records the moment cleanly. The emperor, Vespasian, put a levy on the urine trade, and his son Titus objected, disgusted that the imperial treasury would take money from something so foul. Vespasian held a coin from the first payment up to his son's nose and asked whether the smell offended him. Titus said no. Whereupon Vespasian said, and yet it comes from urine. The phrase that survives from it, money does not stink, is still quoted 2,000 years later, and public urinals in France are still called pas en. There is a darker footnote. Catullus, in poem 39, mocks a man named Ignatius for his gleaming white smile and explains it. Ignatius is Celtaion from Spain, and the custom there, Catullus says with open cruelty, is to scrub the teeth and gums every morning with your own urine. The ammonia whitens. Genuinely does. Ignatius had, by the standards of the chemistry, an effective dental routine, and he was being ridiculed for it in verse. So Rome scrubbed. It scrubbed harder and more systematically than any society before it, and probably harder than anywhere else on Earth would for the next 1,500 years. 11 aqueducts feeding the city, public latrines seating dozens at once. The cloaca maxima carrying waste out to the Tiber. Bathhouses on nearly every block, so cheap that a laborer could afford entry, so central that going to the baths was what you did with an afternoon, which is why the bones make no sense. Piers Mitchell, at the University of Cambridge, did something nobody had done properly before. Instead of arguing from architecture, he went looking for the parasites. 2016, in the journal Parasitology, he published a survey pulling together the evidence from across the Roman world, from latrine sediments and cesspits and coprolites and burials, and compared it with what people were carrying in the Bronze Age and Iron Age before Rome arrived with its plumbing. Sanitation worked the way the story says it works. The graph should fall off a cliff. It does not fall at all. Whipworms still there, roundworms still there. Tu meba his tu, lit ka. The meba that causes dysentery still there, in the same latrines the Romans were so proud of. The intestinal parasites that spread through human feces getting into human mouths were just as common under Roman sanitation as they had been without it. One of them went up. Fish tapeworm, which people pick up from raw or undercooked fish, appears more often in the Roman period than before. You can see the answer coming, and it is worse than a design flaw. The sewers moved the waste. They did not destroy it. Human excrement was collected and taken out to the fields as fertilizer, which is efficient, and which puts the eggs of every intestinal worm in the city straight back onto the food supply. The baths so admired were often drained rarely, heated to a comfortable warmth, and scummed with oil and human skin, which is a description of an incubator. Some Roman writers complain about the film on the water, and in the latrine, that long stone bench with the row of holes, communal, sociable, no partitions. There was the zelof, spongium, a sea sponge lashed to a stick. You used it. You rinsed it in the channel of water running along the floor, and you passed it to the man next to you. As for fish tapeworm rising, Mitchell's suggestion points at garum, the fermented fish sauce Rome poured on everything, made from uncooked fish left to break down in salt and shipped in for to every province in the empire, a national condiment as a vector. So the plumbing changed the smell of the city, not change what was living inside the people in it. And that sponge on a stick has a relative 4,000 miles east, in a desert latrine, coated in something that should not have been able to get there. You have never been clean. Not once. Not after the hottest shower you have ever taken. Not after the surgery scrub. Not now. Around 38 trillion bacterial cells are riding on your skin and packed into your gut at this moment, and the water never touched most of them. What you call hygiene is not removal. It is negotiation. Here is the part that should unsettle you. Your immune system was assembled by all the things your ancestors failed to wash off. In 1989, an epidemiologist named David Strachan published a short paper in the British Medical Journal that nobody expected to matter. He had followed 17,000 British children and found that hay fever tracked almost perfectly against one variable, and it was not diet, income, or air quality. It was how many older siblings a child had. More older brothers and sisters meant less hay fever. Strachan's suggested explanation was infection passed between children in crowded homes, and the idea grew into what people now call the hygiene hypothesis. Then came a comparison so clean, it almost looks staged. 2016, a team publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine studied two farming communities in the United States, the Amish of Indiana and the Hutterites of South Dakota. Same ancestral European stock. Similar diet, similar family sizes, no smoking, no indoor pets, no vaccinations differing much between them. One difference: the Amish farm with horses and live beside their animals. The Hutterites farm industrially, on machines at a distance. Asthma in Amish children ran at 5%. In Hutterite children, 21%, 4 times higher. When the researchers pumped Amish house dust into the noses of mice, the mice were protected from airway disease. Hutterite dust did nothing. Dust as medicine. The barn was doing something the machine could not. None of that argues for filth. Look at Ignaz Semmelweis, VNA, 1847, working a maternity ward where women died of childbed fever at 3 times the rate of the ward next door, and discovering the difference was doctors walking from the dissection room to the delivery bed without washing. He told them to scrub with chlorinated lime. Deaths collapsed. He was ridiculed, dismissed, and died in an asylum. Medical hand washing is younger than the telegraph. It buys you a life your ancestors could not have bought at any price. But it came bundled with something. You stripped out the parasites and the pathogens and the daily bath of microbes. And an immune system built across 2 million years of exposure found itself with nothing to answer. So it answers pollen. It answers peanuts. It answers your own gut lining. You have never been clean. Your ancestors picked their teeth with sticks 430,000 years ago, sealed the story of their lives in the plaque they never scraped away, chewed poplar bark for the pain, washed their clothes in urine collected from the street, and passed a wet sponge hand to hand in a room full of strangers. Every one of them was carrying a load you would find intolerable, and every one of them was being tuned by it. Their bodies were calibrated by exactly what they failed to wash off. Yours is still waiting for a dirt that never comes. If the world you came from feels a little closer now, that's exactly the point. Subscribe, and every week we'll uncover another piece of who you used to be.